Hi everyone, it's Amy here from the blog I Think Therefore I Teach. Welcome to your next philosophy instalment. This one is for the second year DCT topic of gender and society. One of my favourites. So, let's get going. Now this one isn't too long, not as long as gender and theology, but it sets the foundations to really appreciate how gender, society and Christianity have all had an influence on each other. So the first thing I get my students to do is just to discuss different ideas of gender, what the implications towards different genders are. We then go straight into the idea of socialization. So socialization is how we learn the norms of our society. From this we develop our gender identification and expression. So I get my students to write down 5 ways that gender is acquired in our society. So distinguishing expectations of being a boy or a girl. And so my students talk about things like gender reveal parties, they talk about the clothes, the books, the colours that are associated at a young age, the toys that you play with, the sports that you play at school that you do and do not have access to. And then we talk about how the ways that this is changing, so how girls can maybe take up football or rugby now, how I'm trying to think of other examples that we talk about. How people are less focused on the pink and the blue, so they might put babies in different colours. How areas are maybe doing more children's wear rather than a girls and a boys section. So we talk about the different ways that this is changing, things like unisex toilets rather than male or female toilets. We then start with this idea of patriarchy and feminism, which is a core idea throughout the whole of this topic, the idea of patriarchy. Most societies in the world are patriarchal. This means men tend to dominate social structures such as government, so the law making and workplaces. Also, they're seen in domestic relationships such as the man being head of the household. So the question that I get my students to consider and then discuss is, why? How has it happened that all of these societies that over the years have not had any relationship with each other, have all ended up being male dominated and male run? And so we look right back to the evolutionary idea of when there was cave people, how the women were pregnant often or looking after the children, and so therefore the men had to be the hunters and the foragers in order to be able to survive. But then there's other studies that now show that when women weren't pregnant or with children, that they were just as much hunters and gatherers as the men were. So we look at how this has happened, we look at the personalities of men and female, and how what might have concluded that societies on the whole are patriarchal. There is, of course, no answer to this. There is no right or wrong. It's just an interesting thing to discuss. One area that you could link this to is education, and the fact that women were not educated as often or as much as men. So it was the boys that were educated first, and often because education was so expensive, parents didn't have the money to educate both boys and girls. One of the best early feminist texts was written by Mary Wollstonecraft in 1792. It was called The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. In this, she set out an argument for educating both women and men to the same standard. And of course, we cannot talk about education without bringing in Malala here. She says, "I raise up my voice, not so I can shout, but so that those without a voice can be heard. We cannot succeed when half of us are held back." Malala is an absolutely extraordinary individual. If you've never come across her before, please look into her, look into the work that she's still currently doing. But basically, Malala grew up in an environment where women were not allowed to be educated. And so she stood up against the Taliban, she stood up against the patriarchal system to say, we will be educated. And in one event, she was on the way to school, or the school environment she had created with some of her female friends with their books, etc. The Taliban stopped the bus, got on the bus and said, "Where is Malala?" which is the name of her book. It's I Am Malala is the name of her book, because basically she stood up and said, "I am Malala." At that point they shot her in the head and she survived, and so she was given asylum and refuge and she survived. But rather than cowering back, she has stood up and fought the system. She has fought the system that tried to repress her and fought the system that tried to kill her. An amazing individual. We then bring in feminism which was originally called the Women's Liberation Movement. So that's why feminism is often associated with women, because originally It was the women's liberation, freeing of women. And they worked on removing the restrictions of a patriarchal society so that women could enjoy the same freedoms as men. And so obviously feminism has many faces now. It has changed many times. And so this idea that feminism was originally for women, but maybe now promoting more just equality to both sexes, is where we are evolving to. We then have a quote from Aristotle in the History of Animals. Who do you think he's talking about, men or women? More mischievous, less simple, more impulsive, more compassionate, more easily moved to tears, more jealous, more querulous, more apt to scold and to strike, more prone to despondency and less hopeful, more void of shame or self-respect, more false of speech, more deceptive, of more attentive memory, also more wakeful, more shrinking, more difficult to rouse to action. Now, of course, Aristotle here is talking about women. And students are often quite split whether he's talking about men or women here, because they see Aristotle as quite forward thinking. When it comes to women, he wasn't as much. And the way that he saw women, he would not see men in the same way. So, for example, when I discuss this with my students, we look at this idea of more void of shame or self-respect. That's a judgment you put on somebody else. And Aristotle, in the time that he lived in the ancient Greeks, men had no shame. They went to the baths, they walked around naked, they were very open sexually. Men had no restrictions at all, so there was no shame put on men. It was women that had the restrictions, and therefore shame was put upon them. This idea of more false of speech means lying, more difficult to rouse to action means lazy, and more jealous, more argumentative, more prone to despondency and less hopeful, this idea of depressive nature. So this negative connotations that he's applying towards women. Yes, he's talking about compassionate and easily moved to tears, but that again sounds slightly of a criticism more than a compliment. So do you agree with all these statements? How would you engage yourself with this quote? And for an exam, you would not need to write that whole quote down. Just picking a small part of it to use as part of your argument would be brilliant. We need to continue then to look into the ancient ideas, so we cannot forget about Plato when we start looking at our ancient ideas. So the historical views of male and female gender roles. Plato believed, along with the rest of his generation, that women were inferior. Inferior is a word that comes up an awful lot through the history of how women are spoken about. It is only males who are created directly by the gods and are given souls. So basically, women are soulless. We are without souls. This is in his book Timaeus. In other words, being born a woman was just unfortunate. However, in Plato's defence, he did support the idea that women should be treated fairly and should not be treated as possessions of men. Oh, well, that's very nice of you to point that out, Plato. I'm pleased we established that I should not be treated as a possession and should be treated fairly, even though inferior. Now, the reason why I think it's important that students cover Plato, and Aristotle's coming again next, is so that you can recognise that it is not just Christianity that has pushed out these views about women, that actually, without Christianity, the patriarchal system, the male-run society, both Aristotle and Plato are both educated men, whereas the women will not have been educated as much, have really had a huge impact on the way that society historically has seen men and women. Their influence was huge, and so for people like Plato to talk about women as inferior has had a massive negative effect. So it's not just Christianity to blame. And so when you use Plato, for example, in an essay, please be clear, he is not linked to Christianity in any way. He is not supporting Christianity, he's not criticising Christianity, but it's a way for you to show that Christianity is not solely to blame for the way that we view women. Aristotle's opinions were highly influential on Western thought, maybe because of his support of science. He was known as the father of formal logic, extremely influential, and he argued that women were naturally inferior again to men. And this was from his observations of society. Therefore, men have a right to rule women, and women should submit. So this idea now of not only are we inferior naturally, so it's something we can't help, we are naturally inferior, we should therefore follow the rule of men and submit to men. The question is, why? According to Aristotle, because women cannot produce semen, they are therefore defective. He didn't know about females having eggs or having menstrual cycles, for example. So because of that, he concluded that the male is active in reproduction and females simply passive. A female is simply the incubator or the cooker for a baby, and the man does everything else. So without men, the human population would decease. That we do not need women for anything. They are simply passive in the creation and the making of it, and that it's men that we need. And so we can look at this now and laugh, because we can say that his understanding of science was so limited based on what he knew about women and biology. But the problem is that that view significantly influenced future people. That's the issue we have, is that he was wrong. We know he is wrong, but actually the veins of what he is saying has infiltrated the societal view. So we now have this view of women. We don't quite know where it's come from in order to stop it. And actually one of the places it might have come from is the influence of Aristotle. One of the people we know that is significantly influenced by Aristotle is, of course, Aquinas. This is one of the links between Christianity and Aristotle. Aquinas continued that women are inferior to men in physical strength and intelligence. Aquinas also used the word defective when comparing women to men. However, he did say that whilst inferior, women have a special high place in heaven with the Virgin Mary. Oh, well, isn't that lovely? We can live our lives as defective and inferior, but at least we get to go to heaven to be with the Virgin Mary. Now, again, we can look at this and think critically of how, wrong it is to see women as defective because of false understandings. However, Aquinas is significantly influential when it comes to the Catholic Church. His natural law theories, don't use contraception, the ideas of what is and isn't natural, like homosexuality, the things that have influenced the Catholic Church have come from Aquinas. Aquinas, as we know, is heavily influenced by Aristotle and the idea of the four causes and cosmology. And so you can start to see the seeds of where these ideas have come from, and these seeds that we still are living with today. And so, in defence of Aquinas, if a defence is possible, this idea of women being inferior in physical strength and intelligence, well, we kind of were. Physical strength, men are stronger than women. A woman can build up her strength, but men are naturally, with very little effort, stronger. So women can still have the same strength as a man, but she would have to work on it quite hard. And as far as intelligence, women were less intelligent because we were educated. So of course men who could read and write on the whole were more educated, but that again was because of the patriarchal system that did not educate women. At this point, then, it's important to bring Christianity into the mix. Christianity has traditionally taught that men and women were created by God to have different complementary qualities. The Bible teaches us that within a marriage, a man should be in charge and his wife should submit. And so, without further ado, it's worth looking at the wedding vows as printed in the Book of Common Prayer. Once again, you do not need to remember all of this or write all of this in your exam. That just being able to pick out the key differences would be enough. Sorry, my cat. You would just need to pick out the key differences. So, groom, I, Harold, take thee, Winifred, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I plight thee my troth. Bride, I, Winifred, take thee, Harold, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love, cherish, and obey, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I give thee my troth. Now, once again, you do not need to remember that whole quote. Remembering that it's in the Book of Common Prayer is important, and then picking out the key differences. This would be a whole theme in your essay. You could really go to town with this and what it implies. And so, for example, women have to not only love, cherish, they also have to obey. And so getting the definition of obey, just type in obey definition into Google and getting the definition, that really helps you put into context. But if you do, My cat's being fussy. If you do, you'll see the word submit there. So it's the idea of obey and submit go together. But what's far more interesting is the difference in the use of the word I plight thee, my troth, and I give thee, my troth. That's where the interesting part comes in. And I've been teaching this for many, many years. And it was only recently that with my classes that I actually Google definitioned plight. And so if you put plight again into Google definitions, the meaning of it is something like dangerous territory or something that you really don't want to be part of. It is so negative, is the word plight by definition. So basically it's saying that the man is, if he must, even though he doesn't want to, and it's dangerous territory, he gives you the my troth promise. Whereas a woman has to just give. She gives her promise freely. The man has to under sufferance. So there's quite a good bit of discussion that you could have there. Feminists argue that women should have the same rights and freedoms as men. They object to the idea that men have a natural authority over women. And in fairness, they are correct that there shouldn't be a natural authority over women. But in the same right, women should have the same rights and freedoms as men. Men should also have the same rights and freedoms as women. So one of the things that I discuss with my class is the idea of single dads or weekend dads or dads that are looking after their babies. And you will often find that baby changing rooms are in the female toilets. Where does a man change his baby? Or if a dad's taking his daughter out for the day and a young child, when it comes to toilets, to bathrooms, you can't really take a little girl into a male bathroom when there's troughs there. But he can't really go into the female loo. So you've got that massive inequality there where people are expecting the female to be with the daughter at all points. Everyone's expecting the mother to always be with the babies in order to change them. That's why they're in the toilets. So it's an interesting one that if we want the same rights and females for women, which we should, the same should also be for men, which I know is a lot of what feminists are arguing, that it's equality across. Men and women are equal in worth. Men and women have equal worth but have different skills and aptitudes. Certain occupations are better suitable to men. It is not a specific gender is better. And so this is best seen in this idea that women cannot become priests or other positions of authority within the church. Now, as I was saying to my students, this should be a little bit clearer actually, so it's my fault, in that not all denominations of Christianity are against ordaining women. The Church of England have ordained women. I think Methodists have ordained women. It's mainly Catholicism that do not ordain women. So when I use the word church, I'm using it too loosely, really. I should say within the Catholic Church more, because other denominations of Christianity have come forward and changed that. They should not take on any role where they are representing Christ. So Holy Communion, for example, the body and blood of Christ, you need a man to be able to give the body and blood of a man, Jesus. A woman cannot do this according to the key views. For example, the Catholic Church does not ordain women to priesthood as Jesus only had male disciples. The question now is, did he? Did Jesus only have male disciples? Now, this is more of a conspiracy theory than anything of any accuracy or academia, but what you've got to question is, did Jesus really have only male disciples, or are we only aware of the male disciples? As in, men wrote the Bible, men edited the Bible, therefore did men edit women out of the Bible? Was it actually that Mary Magdalene, there was a view for many years that she was a prostitute. There was no evidence for Mary Magdalene being a prostitute whatsoever. It was probably more than likely that Jesus had an extremely close relationship to Mary Magdalene, and more than likely she would have been a disciple of Christ. When you look at it, the way that Jesus treated women, whether you've got the stoning of the adulterous woman, the bleeding woman that touched his cloak, Jesus was extremely patient, kind and open towards women. Yet the view that was then depicted in the Bible wasn't quite fitting always with this impression that we got from Jesus. Why would Jesus only have had male disciples? At the end of the day, the first person Jesus visited when he came back from the dead, when he resurrected, was Mary Magdalene, a woman. She thought he was the gardener at first, but he came back to a woman. It was a woman that mopped his brow when he carried the cross. He was extremely close to his mother. In the famous picture of the Last Supper, we can depict that one of them potentially Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene was an awful lot of places with Christ. So it either implies she was in a relationship with Jesus, or she was also a disciple. But it might be, therefore, that her texts have been taken out of the Bible rather than the fact that she never was recorded as one. Also, God chose Jesus to be a man, not a woman. And I get my students to discuss why. Now, it's very important to remember that Jesus may have not been the first one God sent. God might have sent a woman to us. Chances are a woman back in them days would have lasted all of about 4 days before being stoned to death as a heretic or going against the views of society. A woman would never have been able to come and say, I am the incarnation of God. God is working through me. A woman could never have done that. We needed Christ. And don't forget, it was, Jesus did not have an easy time at all. Jesus was not well accepted by society. Think back to your personal Jesus topic. It's not that Jesus was accepted more, it was just that it was slightly easier because people listened to men more than they did women. Once again, because of the patriarchy, because Christianity at this point didn't even exist. However, the Church of England does ordain females, arguing that God calls people, not gender specific. Christianity is therefore sometimes blamed for perpetuating injustice by giving support to the idea that women need not be treated as well as men. That idea of perpetuating injustice is a fabulous phrase to use. It's the idea that Christianity is basically constantly adding fuel to the fire, constantly keeping this injustice going. Maybe partly, but not on the whole of Christianity. So the question then is, do you think Christianity should change in order to keep up to date, or should it work on maintaining traditional values? And for me, I don't think Christianity can win. As in, if Christianity stayed traditional, everybody would criticise Christianity for saying too traditional. As in, they still reject homosexuality, women in the church, they want... very much promoting the different roles of men and women, etc. If they really push these traditional values, they'd be criticised. But then when they change to keep up to date, people say that it lacks integrity and historical value. So can Christianity actually win? Because Christianity is constantly changing. You've got the papal encyclicals, so the Pope's updates, each time he does them. You have the idea of the Vatican II, where they completely reworked most of the key texts. So we still have the Bible, but there are updates like the ordaining of women, updates like the recognition of homosexuality, that you can be ordained as a priest even if you're homosexual, things like that. So there is movement, but do we still criticise Christianity for that then? Can they actually win? Traditional Christian views. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Is there any hint of male superiority there? Now, when I first wrote this PowerPoint many years ago, and I read that, I thought, no, there's not really much male superiority. It really implies quite an equal idea. I showed it to my first class and they absolutely tore it apart. And in fairness, they picked out things I hadn't recognised or realised. So yes, a male pronoun is used to describe God, his own image. God, he created them. He created them. So this idea that God is given a male pronoun. And so this is the idea that if God is male, then male is God. And that's where Mary Daly goes in the next topic. So is it just because, so is the defence that a pronoun had to be used, and that though they did not have enough pronouns back then to be able to talk about God in neither term? So is it just simply that certain pronouns are given to certain ideas? So, for example, a ship is often seen as a female term, a female pronoun. Mother Nature, Mother Earth is a female. So is it the idea that we just always associated God with the male pronoun with no deeper connotations, or is it because God is associated with male? We then have the fact that male and female, that he put male first rather than female first, but then that would create an unequal balance. And I think it's quite nice that both male and female are recognised there. Mankind is more of a translation in that it does mean humankind. It's a translation that's made it mankind, so that really isn't any issue with that one to work with. But for me, this idea that God still created them in his own image, in his own likeness, he created them, this implies a sense of maybe a little bit of a level of equality. So if it's not fully from the quote in Genesis, and this is again a really important quote, so I do recommend you write it down and you learn it, where does this male superiority come from? The problems come in further when you look at the second Genesis story, Adam and Eve and the fall of man. So male is created first. So Adam is created first. Adam is given stewardship over all the animals, and God says you can name them, you can look after them, and you are the ruler and steward over them. And then Adam turns around to God and says, God, I'm lonely. I want somebody that's like me. The animals are lovely, but there's no one like me. So Adam goes to sleep. God takes rib of Adam and makes woman. And so woman is made from the rib of man. So Eve is made from the rib of Adam. And so this is the idea that she was then created as a companion and a helper. She was an afterthought. She wasn't originally made. It was an afterthought. And obviously you have all the different layers and connotations of Lilith as well. Look into the idea of Lilith. Lilith was the first woman created, and that all went wrong. So it's very interesting looking into the Lilith story. But it's the idea that woman was created as his companion and his helper. He was still in charge, and woman only exists because man asked for her. The problems, of course, continue. Who can forget that woman was first to succumb to temptation? This passage is sometimes used to support the belief that women are weaker-willed than men, results in the view that men should take the lead in decision-making and should not always be swayed by a woman. The question is, couldn't Adam have said no? So people really focus on the tree. It's not about the tree at all. The point was, it was the first covenant established by God and man. And so humans had to have free will. We are made in the image of God, but with free will. Adam and Eve could do anything they wanted to in paradise. That means there's no free will. If you can do anything you want, you don't have free will. Free will means you have to have a free choice between different avenues. I freely choose to do that avenue rather than that avenue. Whereas when you can do anything, there's no choice. So God said, in order to make your free will meaningful, I'm going to give you, here's the rule. The rule is, do not touch the tree, don't go near the tree, don't eat from the tree, the knowledge of good and evil, don't go near the tree. And so Adam and Eve said, no, God, we won't. They made a promise to God. That was the first covenant. So it's not the fact that they took the apple, it's the fact they broke the promise. And so the snake comes along, tempts Eve, take the apple, take the apple, take the apple. She takes the apple and gives it to Adam, who then eats it and passes it back to Eve. Now, all of this would have been made so much better if Adam had turned around and go, no, woman, put the apple down. But he didn't. He took it and ate it. So, woman was weaker-willed for taking the apple. So why was man any better then? Isn't man just as weak-willed for then taking it and eating it? If man is so much better as far as decision-making, you'd have thought he'd have said, no, I'm not eating it, put it down. But he didn't. What I said to my students is that I think however this story would have been written, women would have come off worse. If Adam had taken the apple and given it to Eve, and Eve had have eaten it, she'd have been the weaker-willed one for eating it. Eve just happened to take the apple and give it to Adam. She was weak because she took it. I think that however that would have been written, women would have ended up worse. Because again, when you drive your own agendas, as a lot of the male writers of the Bible and then future, like St. Augustine's, for example, when you are driving your own agenda, you can easily make the story work to what you want. So do you think Genesis stories portray women as naturally weaker than men? Ephesians. Now this is one of my favourite areas. Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your own husbands. Just to be clear, it's no one else's husband. Own husbands as you do the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife as Christ is the head of the church. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. Now, I get my students to discuss those two questions. Do you think this has positive or negative connotations? What does this tell us about the Christian teachings and the roles of men and women in family and society? So, first glance at this quote, it's fairly shocking. Women have to submit. Men just have to love their wives. This idea that a woman is being compared to a church building, that the husbands, submit to your husbands as you do the Lord. That means husband and Lord are associated in the same way. So this means again that husbands and men are seen on par with Jesus. The idea that the husband is head of the wife, so the husband is still in charge of the wife, just as Christ ran and was head of the church. And all men have to do is just love your wife. So on the outset, with that quote, it seems extremely condemning of women. However, I highly advise you to read the whole passage. That is taken significantly out of context. That is significantly shorter than the whole part. I think it's 52 and 53, and 22 and 23. The actual whole passage shows this in a very different light. You also have to put this in historical context. So this quote has been taken out of the historical context, the history. This quote has been taken out of the rest of the context of the text to be used in order to say women submit and men just love your wives. That is not the case or the aim of this text. So, back in biblical times, back in the times when they were writing about, men could have many lovers. They could dispose of women freely. They could have mistresses, concubines. Women were there for a man's pleasure, and that's it only. And so once a woman had lost her virginity, once a woman was no longer pure, then she was no good to any other man. So what men would do is they would promise the woman the earth, sleep with them, then dispose of them when the next attractive female walked by. And so that woman then that's left, that is no longer a virgin, is uneducated, so can't gain any food, any money, so is uneducated, is no longer a virgin, therefore nobody will marry her. She is completely desolate. She can't do anything, and so then she'd become a beggar on the streets or something worse. And so it's the idea that what Christianity brought in was this idea of no. If you want to be with that woman, you are with that woman and only that woman. And you are going to look after her and you are going to love her just as Christ loves the church. So actually, this is quite condemning on men. Women, yes, have to submit to their husband, but women have always had to submit to a man. They had to submit to their dad because the men, again, are the ones that were educated. So women always needed men. What this is actually saying is that the husband needs to actually love the wife as much. And the text goes on to say that the husband has to love the wife like he loves himself. So how much he loves his own body, he needs to love the wife in the same way. And so this is actually condemning of men, having to remind them that you have to love your wife. You have to look after this woman you've signed up for. You have to look after this pure, unblemished individual that, is maybe no longer a virgin now because you've taken that purity away. You are now stuck with them. And so just as Christ loved the church is the body of Christ on the planet. The church is so important. And so just as Christ loved the church, you have to also love your wife. And so this is reading the rest of the text and understanding it historically about how men abused and discredited women actually puts it in a whole different understanding. Biblical patriarchy is where the Bible is cited as justification for men having complete authority in the home. So if you take out that quote from the rest of the text, as I've said, that's an example of biblical patriarchy. When Mary Daly in the next topic says God is male, therefore male is God, that again is biblical patriarchy. You are picking out parts of the Bible to justify men having complete authority. Christian egalitarianism, on the other hand, is where husband and wife within marriage should be mutually respectful and supportive without dominating the other. So that egalitarian equality. And so, I get the students to read the full text that I give them. Oh, it's up to 33. And again, how this changed their initial judgment on that quote. You don't, for your exam, have to know all of it, but I think that really understanding the true context of it is extremely important. Pope John Paul II, then. We bring John Paul back in. He wrote an open letter in 1988 called the Mulieris Dignitatum. It's very, very important that, again, you reference and that you know about this. This is on the dignity and rights of women. This was in a response to accusations the church was sexist. Oh, who on earth would argue the church is sexist? The Pope wrote about the different skills and qualities of women and focused on examples of Christian devotion set by female European saints. He emphasised that men and women have different but complementary characteristics. God came to the earth as Jesus, but this was only possible because of a woman, the Virgin Mary. Aha! We would not have had Jesus if it wasn't for a woman. Brilliant. Our whole inferiority complex now has been removed because Jesus is only here because of us. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's really going to appease the amount of sexism that's being promoted. It gets worse. Pope John Paul II then says that the fulfilment of female personality, we are fulfilled as females in two ways, being virgins and then mothers. That is how we fulfill our female destiny. Motherhood. This enables a woman to be self-giving as she has a special openness to a new person. I really hope the special openness isn't what I'm thinking about. Anyway, women are naturally disposed to motherhood. Now, that's an area that you could really argue, question, potentially disagree with, but it's this idea that he's saying that women are natural mothers, that therefore if you don't want children, are you not fulfilling your female personality? That you are therefore unnatural if you aren't a mother. And so both physically and psychologically we are disposed to motherhood. This is a gift from God. Whilst parenthood is shared, a husband owes a special debt to the woman. Oh, isn't that good? Finally, the husbands recognise, you owe me a special debt. I am physically and psychologically disposed to motherhood. You should have that on your fridge. However, he does repeat the word passive to describe pregnancy as something that happens rather than actively done. Needless to remind you that Pope John Paul II not only was not a woman, so therefore has never actually given birth or been pregnant for him to be able to talk about, he probably has never had sex either, certainly not when he started moving up the ranks, because he would have practiced celibacy. So it reminds me of that quote about speaking about things you are aware of and otherwise staying quiet. But he talked about how pregnancy was something that happens rather than actively done, and that the pain of childbirth is due to original sin, but also gives insight into the pain of Christ. Wow, there is so much there and so many potential problems there. So first of all, the pain of childbirth is due to original sin. Thanks St. Augustine once more for that. Yes, it is in the Bible that one of the punishments of Eve was painful birth, so that does stand there. But this idea again of original sin, you know, the fact that we still have painful childbirth because of Eve, get over it. No, it's because of evolution. But then this idea that it also gives insight into the pain of Christ. So let me get this straight. Women cannot be priests because Jesus only had male disciples, and a woman cannot give over some bread and consecrated wine because she is not a man. Yet a woman actually experiences potentially multiple times in her life the pain that Christ went through on the cross. Does that not seriously trump men? At the end of the day, a man just gets to be a priest because he has the right genitalia of Jesus, whereas a woman, he's arguing, actually has deep insight into the pain that Christ suffered, yet because, again, she is not a man, she cannot be ordained into priesthood. The contradiction there seems just immense. But again, it gives you nice discussion for an essay. Do check out the Mulieris Dignitatum in order to get your quotes. Nearly there. Motherhood then, liberating or restricting. Feminist writer Simone de Beauvoir wrote in the 1940s about the ways that motherhood forces women to suspend their own interests and personality in order to take care of children. This view was startlingly unconventional, but struck a chord with many women who still did not have birth control readily available. It wasn't until the 1960s married women could receive the contraceptive pill, and 1974 for single women. Now, 1974 will seem like a million years ago for you lot, because you're all 2000 babies. But for me, that's really close to when I was born. That's only about 10 years out, give or take. That's really frightening that only 10 years from when I was born, that single women had only just been able to have the contraceptive pill. And so the reason for that, again, is because of the male patriarchy deciding when women should be able to control their sexual activity. And so it's the idea that if you were married, well, why on earth would you want contraception? Because the purpose of sex is to reproduce. So therefore, if you stopped reproducing, you stop having sex. Why would you need contraception? So it took till the 1960s to realise, actually, we still want to have sex and intimacy, we just don't want any more children, so therefore birth control was brought in. But it wasn't until the 1974 where, oh, God forbid, a single woman might have sex outside of marriage and therefore wanted to protect herself. It wasn't until 1974 that was actually not necessarily even recognised or allowed, but it was just like, oh, fair enough, here's the contraception, we'll just turn a blind eye to it if we must. But you might think that things like this now are a bit silly, and that it seems daft that contraception was not readily available. But look what's happening in Texas with abortion. When you look at what's happening in Texas and the fact that abortion has now been made illegal in certain areas, that ruling has been brought in by congressmen. This is the idea of men who are middle class, mostly in their 50s and 60s, making decisions about what a woman should and should not do to her body. So whilst this seems really archaic in the fact that we didn't make birth control readily available, we are going backwards in certain areas, and again, you can talk about that. But Simone de Beauvoir, I studied a part of her when I did gender at university, is superb. She's marvellous, very, very interesting woman, so do check her out. We then bring in Anne Oakley, a sociologist, who wrote about the negative side effect of motherhood, interviewing women who said during giving birth they felt powerless as when men, doctors, take over, the maternal instinct is due to socialization, not biology, and how frustrating it is to be a stay-at-home mother. Now, I've never looked into this study in more detail. I don't know which women she asked, what their backgrounds, their situation, their age, their economic, anything about this study. And it always was very interesting to look into actual studies and the research methods used in order to be able to see whether the context of their findings are to be taken, seriously. But part of what she's saying there, this idea that during giving birth they felt powerless, well, I don't know if men have anything to do with that, because I imagine giving birth you would be pretty powerless anyway, whether there is a man there or not. And that men doctors take over, that's what a doctor's job is. I imagine most women giving birth want that, oh no, I can't intervene, I'm a male doctor, I can't jump in, but the baby's going to die, the woman's going to die, oh no. At the end of the day, the man does, the male doctors do intervene. And obviously there might be female doctors as well, we're overgeneralising, but it's the fact that a doctor is a doctor, his job is to help both the mother and the child, and help them. Most midwives are female as well, so this idea that men take over, I think that's the point of their job. Maternal instinct is due to socialization, not biology. That's a very, very interesting one. This idea that little girls are given dollies and Barbies and cooking sets, and this idea of having, little babies that they look after, and little bottles and cleaning and things like that, cleaning the baby and stuff. So, that definitely you could link that into how it's part of our socialization, not just biological. And then this idea of how frustrating it is to be a stay-at-home mother. I think my only thought there is that in today's society, a woman that can financially afford to stay at home and be a stay-at-home mother, yes, whilst it would be frustrating, I think is very fortunate, because there's a lot of women on the other side that would like to stay at home with their babies and that they can't because of financial reasons. So I think it's frustrating whichever side, and I think, many things in life can be seen as frustrating. And to be honest with you, if you get anybody on a bad day, a parent, they would say something similar. And so again, it's Take this with a pinch of salt as to far as how accurate it is without looking into it in more detail. I might be completely wrong though, and it might be an extremely thorough study. Finally, let's start the Mary Daly drum roll, because Mary Daly is where we'd be going next. Mary Daly is already on YouTube as far as the video that I've done for her. Check it out. It is just mind-boggling. The things I had to put in the things I have to go through and say for the Mary Daly PowerPoint is just things you would never ever expect someone to say. 1928 to 2010, I'm only disappointed that she never was really in the age of social media. I think she'd be an absolute menace. I think she'd have been brilliant on social media. But, oh boy, here we go. The pun is intended. Daly argued that women's abilities and knowledge are superior to those of men, and therefore women ought to govern men, as this would result in a much more peaceful society and would be also better for the environment. So we should rule the world, we should govern men, it would lead to a much more peaceful society and better for the environment. There she is. I saw women that were repressed. This is when she was teaching in schools and said that she would not teach men, only women. When they're in classes with young men, they shut up all the time. They're laughed at if they have unusual ideas. They have to be sexy. Then they can't really think. Clearly never been in a modern day philosophy class, for example, but her view there, and therefore she stopped teaching men. She would not teach boys at all. She'd only teach females. She is a very educated woman. It's interesting looking into her background and her history, especially her relationship with Christianity, but she is extremely outrageous. Whether she can be called a feminist at all is up to you to decide. If she may be seen as a radical feminist, again, that's your decision. But do check out the PowerPoint on Mary Daly for gender and theology. Otherwise, a quick discussion question I get my students to think about and write. Should official Christian teachings resist current secular views of gender? So official teachings, you would have to establish what do official Christian teachings mean. So what are you actually talking about there? Should they resist current? So what are the current secular views, and should they resist them? So what angle are you going to argue? What words are you going to define and explain in your introduction? And which arguments, names and views would you apply in your essay? Hopefully you found that useful. Don't forget to subscribe so that you never miss out on any of the videos. If you have any questions or comments, please post them below, or just any general thoughts that you might have on gender, society or Christianity, and I look forward to reading them. Otherwise, bye for now everyone. Bye for now.